On the morning of October 7th, 2023, I boarded a flight from Chicago to London. I had my week mapped out carefully. I knew where I was staying, who I was meeting, and what I wanted to accomplish. I was headed to have a series of long, serious conversations with Shia scholars, people I had been working with in one form and another for nearly a decade. This is not a new work for me. For years, my professional life had revolved around interfaith dialogue, especially between Christians and Muslims. I believe deeply in that work, and I still do, in many ways. I believe that if you were patient enough, honest enough, and intellectually serious enough, you can build relationships of trust even across deep disagreements. That belief shaped my faith, my scholarship, and the sense of purpose. I believe that sustained dialogue could produce understanding, even if it never produced agreement. And for a long time, that belief felt justified. What I didn't know, as I buckled my seatbelt and turned on my phone to airplane mode as I was departing from Chicago, was that many of the assumptions holding my world together were about to collapse. While I was in the air, somewhere over the Atlantic, Hamas carried out a coordinated, premeditated massacre of Jewish civilians in Israel. More than 1,200 people were murdered, entire families, elderly Holocaust survivors, young people attending a music festival, babies. It was the deadliest single day atrocity against the Jews since the Holocaust. And I didn't know any of that yet. I landed in London late that night, London time. Like anyone else, I turned my phone back on. And suddenly the world I had left that morning no longer existed. The attack took place on Simchat, Torah, and Shabbat. These details matters. It matters religiously. It matters culturally. It matters strategically. This was a moment when families were together, when borders were quiet, when defenses were relaxed. That timing was not accidental. As the hours passed, the details become unbearable. Hamas gunmen went out the door, murdering families in their homes. They raped and mutilated women. They executed parents in front of their children, and children in front of their parents. They burned people alive. They hunted down young people at the Nova Music Festival near Reim, an all-night rave dedicated to peace and music, and slaughtered them as they tried to flee. And then there was something else, something that should have shattered every moral ambiguity immediately. Hamas filmed much of it themselves. They didn't hide what they did. They didn't deny it. They didn't apologize for it. They documented it and broadcast it proudly. That wasn't just violence, that was a performance. Within the logic of Islamist jihad, violence is meant to be seen. Filming atrocities isn't incidental, it's theological. It signals legitimacy. It invites imitation. It claims divine sanction. And when they were saying without words was, this is not a crime, this is obedience. For everyone capable of distinguishing right from wrong, this should have been unmistakable evil. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't contextual. It wasn't morally ambiguous. I assumed naively, as it turns out, that the world would see it the same way. I was wrong. The next morning, I went to central London expecting a city in shock, or at least in pause. Instead, I found hundreds of protesters already in the streets, Palestinian flags everywhere, chants of "from the river to the sea," signs declaring Israel as an apartheid state, slogans calling to globalize the Intifada. This was October 8th. Israel had not launched a single retaliatory strike. Many of the victims hadn't even been identified yet, and yet the protests were already there. What struck me wasn't just the anger, it was the speed, the readiness, the absence of grief, the complete lack of hesitation. This wasn't a response, it was activation, an existing script that had been pulled off the shelf and deployed instantly. As my Uber passed through the crowd, I realized something unsettling. These weren't protests calling for peace. They weren't even primarily protests about policy. They were calling into question the legitimacy of Israel's existence. Zionism is racism, they said. Israel is a colonial project. Make the Intifada worldwide. These are not reformist slogans. These are erasure slogans. They don't imagine coexistence, they imagine disappearance. And in that moment, sitting in traffic in London, watching people celebrate, or at least excuse the mass murder of Jews, something inside me broke. Because the intellectual framework I had relied on for years no longer explained what I was seeing. I understood Islamist movements abroad. I had studied them. I engaged with them. But I had underestimated how deeply embedded their narratives had become in the West. And I had completely underestimated how closely they had fused with Western progressive ideology. What I was witnessing was not simply outrage over Palestinian suffering, it was the convergence of two powerful moral systems, one religious, one secular, that had found common cause. This is often called the Red-Green Alliance, the fusion of Islamist movements with the Western activist left. At the heart of that alliance is a simple moral map. The world is divided into the oppressors and oppressed. Once that division is made, everything else follows automatically. Israel is labeled a settler colonial state. Zionism becomes a unique moral crime. Jews are recast not as people with history and trauma, but as function of power. Within that framework, violence is no longer evaluated by what it does, but by who it does. If the oppressor committed violence, it becomes resistance. If the civilians are murdered, it becomes collateral. If Jews suffer, it becomes irrelevant. Jewish history doesn't fit this map, so it's erased. Jewish vulnerability contradicts the narrative, so it is denied. Jewish trauma is either minimized or reframed as manipulation. And when Islamist ideology enters the space, something especially dangerous happens. Islamist movements do not see violence as tragic but necessary. They often see it as sacred. When that worldview merges with Western moral language, about liberation and justice, you get a powerful story that is emotionally compelling and morally binding. In that story, Jews can be killed and still be cast as villains. I've spent years believing that dialogue alone could bridge those divides. That if we just listen carefully enough, study deeply enough, and sympathize sincerely enough, we can move forward together. October 7th shattered that belief, not because dialogue is worthiness, but because dialogue requires a minimum moral foundation. You have to be willing to look another human being in the eye and acknowledge their humanity. And in London, I saw how quickly that humanity disappeared. There are moments when endless conversation becomes a way of avoiding clarity, when debate becomes a substitute for moral judgment. October 7th didn't require uh, nuance, it required honesty. And honesty meant interrogating the ideologies that could look at mass murder and respond with justification. That realization changed the direction of my work. I began to ask different questions. Not how do we dialogue, but what ideas were driving this hatred? How long do they move from theology to politics to the streets? Ideas don't stay in books, they travel. They move from sacred texts to sermons, from sermons to slogans, from slogans to crowds, then from crowds to violence. You cannot reason with an ideology that treats reason as a tactic rather than a moral commitment. Before engagement can happen, the structure of that ideology has to be understood. That includes taking theology seriously. In my own research, this meant looking closely at Shia Islamists' thought, especially since the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the role of messianic expectation. In some strands of Shia thought, there's an intense focus on the imminent return of the Mahdi, a redeemer figure who will set history right. When politics becomes fused with that expectation, time collapses. When history feels like it is reaching its climax, moral restraint disappears. Violence becomes acceleration. Compromise becomes betrayal. Prudence becomes sin. In certain Islamist narratives, Jews are assigned a fixed role in this cosmic drama, not as neighbors, not as political opponents, but as theological obstacles. In the most extreme versions, Jewish defeat or even annihilation is examined as a sign that redemption is near. Not everyone in Islam believes this. These interpretations are contested, but when they gain traction, anti-Semitism becomes more than prejudice, it becomes obedience. Hatred is no longer optional, it's commanded. Seen this way, anti-Semitism is not just emotional or reactive, it is structural, it is interpretive, it is embedded in stories people tell themselves about history and God and destiny. And that means it cannot be explained away as merely a response to Israeli policy or occupation or grievance. These are explanations, those explanations are comforting, but they are false. What I saw in London made it impossible for me to deny. Modern anti-Semitism is not a leftover superstition. It is a global, adaptable ideology. It speaks the language of human rights while calling for an erasure. It borrows from sacred texts and activist slogans at the same time. It can chant about freedom while celebrating murder. Ignoring it does not make it go away. It makes it stronger. The retaliation forced a change in my own vocation. Dialogue with Muslims still matters deeply to me, but is no longer enough on its own. My responsibility now includes naming, analyzing, and exposing the idea that make violence against Jews morally invisible. That means studying how Scripture is used, how justice language is weaponized, how anti-Semitism hides behind sophistication. It means refusing shortcuts, refusing comforting explanations, refusing to look away. October 7th was not only a geopolitical rupture, it was a moral and intellectual one. And for me, it marked the death of the set of assumptions I can no longer afford to hold. This is where the work begins.